Well, guys, this one took me a little while to make. That's why it's been a while since I've posted. So it's taken a while to put this one together. A lot of research, a lot of work. So I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, and welcome back to another Mater and Tater video. Today's video is going to be kind of a history lesson. And we're going to explore a subject that's kind of fascinated me for a few years now. And have you ever wanted something so bad that you've waited so long for, only have it ripped away from you at the last minute? Well, that's kind of what our video is about. Today we're going to be going over the worst maritime disaster, worse than the Titanic, as far as lives lost in American history. It's kind of been forgotten. It's kind of a forgotten history. So stick around if you want to find out more. In the spring of 1865, the United States was a nation bled dry. After 4 brutal years, the Civil War, the deadliest conflict in American history, was finally staggering to an end. More than 620,000 lives had already been lost, a number so vast that it defies comprehension even today. The Confederacy was crumbling, its armies broken, its people starving, and its cities and fields laid in ruin. For millions, the long nightmare was almost over. On April the 9th of 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The news swept the country like a wave of exhausted relief. Church bells rang in northern towns. Strangers even embraced in the streets. This news was a massive relief for all soldiers, but for men enduring starvation in southern prison camps, it was a literal rebirth for them. They were finally going home. Andersonville Prison in Georgia was a site of unimaginable suffering. Built to house far fewer, it was severely overcrowded, cramming up to 33,000 men into a 26-acre open stockade, 4 times its intended capacity. The sanitation was appalling. A single polluted creek served simultaneously as the source for drinking water, bathing, and latrine runoff. The meager rations they received, often nothing more than a small amount of raw cornmeal mush or, if lucky, worm-infested bacon scraps, fostered rampant disease among the prisoners. Scurvy, dysentery, gangrene were widespread issues, made worse by heavy lice infestations. Besides illness, exposure to the elements was a frequent cause of death. Guards also posed a constant threat. Any prisoner who crossed the interior deadline fence was immediately shot. Out of roughly 45,000 Union soldiers imprisoned there during its 14 months of operation, nearly 13,000 died, resulting in a devastating mortality rate approaching 29%. Conditions at the Confederate prison at Cahaba, Alabama, weren't much better. The facility, an unfinished brick warehouse, housed up to 5,000 men at its most crowded, offering only 7.5 square feet per prisoner. In this cramped space, meager rations of cornbread and occasional meat, combined with infestation of lice, rats, and fleas, led to widespread illness, including scurvy, diarrhea, pneumonia, and chronic weakness. Despite these harsh conditions, the death rate at Cahaba was remarkably low, around 3 to 5%, with only about 147 to 250 recorded deaths. due largely to the humane oversight of Confederate Commander Captain H.A.M. Henderson. Henderson ensured access to clean river water and allowed the local civilians to provide some basic care for prisoners. With the collapse of the Confederate government and its infrastructure following Lee's surrender, the South was pretty much left in ruins. Southern cities and farms were devastated, supply lines were non existent, and the vast network of railroads and telegraph lines had been almost completely destroyed. The commanders at Andersonville and Cahaba had ran out of food and the means to acquire it. So, to avoid a catastrophic mass starvation event, which they could no longer attribute to wartime shortages, they were forced to start releasing prisoners to Union authority, thereby shifting the burden of the prisoners' survival. This process of prisoner release, which had started in late March of 1865 under a flag of truce, accelerated dramatically through April. This rapid evacuation in April of 1865 was driven by logistics, political necessity, and the complete physical breakdown of the Confederacy. It was not just a simple matter of opening the gates because the war was over. It was a frantic effort to move thousands of people before the supporting Confederate systems failed completely. Thousands of walking skeletons, some weighing less than 90 pounds, were loaded into filthy cattle cars on rickety trains and sent west to their destination, Camp Fisk, a sprawling, muddy parole camp 4 miles east of Vicksburg, Mississippi, on the banks of the Big Black River. Here, the Union authorities moved quickly. The arrivals were carried off the trains in blankets or on stretchers, issued fresh blue uniforms, fed nourishing meals for the first time in months, hardtack, beans, and coffee, and given tents to begin the slow crawl back to life. For many, these tents were the first real roofs over their heads in months. On April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox, while the prisoners from Andersonville and Cahaba were still being funneled toward Vicksburg, the unthinkable happened. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. In a single night, the heartbeat of the nation shifted from the joy of homecoming to a cold, paralyzing grief. The timing couldn't have been worse for these men at Camp Fisk. While they were waiting in the mud outside Vicksburg, the government that was supposed to be looking out for them suddenly vanished into a state of emergency. Every telegraph wire in the country was instantly commandeered for one purpose: the death of a president and the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. So while this tragedy was unfolding at Ford's Theater, about 600 miles to the west, another disaster was in the making at the docks in Cairo, Illinois. As John Wilkes Booth stepped into the presidential box in Washington, the steamboat Sultana was tied to the wharf in Cairo, her boilers hissing quietly in the night. She was a beautiful ship, the Greyhound of the Mississippi. She was a side-wheel steamboat, nearly 260 feet long. Built in Cincinnati in 1863, she was designed for speed, built with a narrow, sharp hull that allowed her to slice through the river faster than almost any other boat in her class. She had 4 decks: the main deck, which typically housed the engines, boilers, and heavy cargo like sugar and cotton; the boiler deck, where passenger cabins and main saloon were located; the hurricane deck, which was often crowded with deck passengers; and the Texas deck, the uppermost level where the crew quarters were located, as well as the pilot house. She was famous for her 2 towering smokestacks, topped with decorative iron crowns. When she was under full steam, those chimneys poured out thick plumes of black coal smoke, a sign of the immense power hidden in her belly. Suspended between her 2 smokestacks, she proudly wore the coveted gilded elk antlers. On the Mississippi, you didn't just go out and buy you some antlers. You earned them. They were the ultimate prize for speed, signaling to every captain and passenger on the river that this ship was the reigning champion of that run. She was a regular on the St. Louis to New Orleans run and was known for her reliability. In 1864, she set a record for the trip from New Orleans to Cairo. She made the run in 4 days, 22 hours and 3 minutes. The master of this Greyhound of the Mississippi was Captain J. Cass Mason. Like Booth, Mason was about to become a name linked forever to a national tragedy. Though his motives weren't political, it was profit. Captain Mason was a man of contradictions. He was known on the river as a skilled and highly capable pilot, but was a bit of a showboat and also deeply proud and deeply in debt. In 1865, the steamboat business was cutthroat. Mason wasn't just the captain, he was also part owner of the Sultana, and he was underwater financially. Every trip south was a gamble against bankruptcy. He pushed his crew and his engines with relentless intensity, obsessed with maintaining the Sultana's reputation as the Greyhound of the river. To Mason, those gilded antlers weren't just a trophy. They were a marketing tool desperately needed to stay afloat. So on the morning of April 15th, as the first screams of Lincoln's death raced along the telegraph wires, Mason cast off from Cairo, but not before seizing every newspaper he could lay his hands on. Streaming south into a region where telegraph lines lay in ruins and news traveled slowly, he carried the most explosive cargo imaginable, the first word of the assassination. Mason intended to be the first man to deliver the word of the president's death to the ports in the South. Knowing that the man who brought the news was the man who got the attention. So, as the Sultana turned her nose south, draped in black and flags flying at half-mast, she became a floating newsroom, fueled by coal and the weight of a national secret, racing into a region that had no idea the world had just changed. In Helena, Arkansas, around April 17th, Mason shared the news of Lincoln's death with a brief docking, drawing crowds to the wharf. But it was upon reaching Vicksburg on April 19th that a far more lucrative opportunity presented itself. Vicksburg had become the central collection point for thousands of paroled Union prisoners. The Union government was offering $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer to transport them north to their homes. To a captain teetering on the edge of ruin, those soldiers weren't just survivors, they were a payday. Before the gangplank was secure, Mason was approached by Colonel Reuben Hatch. He was the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg. And he was also a professional opportunist with deep political ties and a documented history of corruption. Colonel Reuben Hatch was no stranger to scandal. As an Illinois officer with deep political connections, including ties to President Lincoln through his brother Ozias Hatch, the state of Illinois Secretary of State, he had a documented history of corruption. Earlier in the war, while serving as assistant quartermaster in Cairo, Illinois, he had been arrested in January of 1862 on orders from Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, taking kickbacks on military supply contracts. He would buy goods cheaply, charging the government inflated prices, and then pocket the differences. Despite overwhelming evidence and Grant's initial conclusion that the charges were justified, influential friends, including letters from Lincoln himself and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, kept Hatch in uniform and out of serious trouble. In 1864, a competency board found him totally unfit, but he retained his post. By 1865, he was moved to quartermaster at Vicksburg. Hatch controlled the lucrative contracts for transporting paroled Union prisoners north. Now he saw another chance for profit. Hatch, aware of Mason's financial desperation, made his pitch, an exclusive deal. Guarantee Mason at least 1,100 to 1,400 paroled prisoners for the return trip north in exchange for a quiet kickback from the government payout.
So Captain Mason and his Sultana was one of these steamboats that was transporting them upriver. So Captain Mason starts this journey in St. Louis on the 13th of April. So going downriver, when he gets to Vicksburg, going downriver, he is approached by Union quartermaster Reuben Hatch. Now, just a little bit about Reuben Hatch. Now, he's a whole chapter in the big book, but he had already been found guilty of falsifying documents, pocketing federal money, just to name a few. So he came up with this scheme to make some more money. So he approached Captain Mason with a deal that Captain Mason could not refuse. He promised him a full boatload of soldiers if he would give him a kickback of some of the money the federal government was going to pay him. So this is why and how the boat was so severely overloaded. So Captain Mason does agree to this. You have to keep in mind everyone at that time was strapped for money, much less the steamboat captain.
By guaranteeing the men to Mason, Hatch had ensured a massive government payout, a portion of which would be quietly slid back into his own pocket. The two men shook hands on a deal that turned thousands of suffering soldiers into a private payday. Mason ordered the lines tossed and continued south to New Orleans. His debts technically solved, but his ship now tethered to a corrupt scheme that would soon demand a much higher price. The Sultana reached New Orleans on April 21st, but Mason's mind was already back in Vicksburg. To him, the city's bustling docks, alive with merchants, cotton factors, and the hum of post-war recovery, were merely an obstacle between him and his payday. In a whirlwind of activity, the crew loaded commercial cargo, 60 to 100 horses and mules destined for northern farms or armies, bales of cotton, the precious southern staple resuming trade, hogsheads of sugar, and these are massive wooden barrels, perhaps 100 or more, weighing tons, wine casks, and other freight to fill his hold and turn a little bit more profit on the return leg. The Sultana also took on about 70 to 100 cabin passengers, civilians who were paying full fare, including families, merchants, and travelers heading north. One of the most unique things that the Sultana was carrying was a live 200-pound alligator kept in a sturdy wooden crate on the main deck, which one story has it the alligator was the ship's mascot. But remember this alligator, you're going to see him again.
So the lower you go on the Mississippi River, the heavier the water is, filled with mud, debris, garbage, everything else that could possibly get stuck in your paddle wheels. So the water is thicker down here. So going upriver was a challenge anyway.
The Sultana departed New Orleans that very same day, heading north up the Mississippi River. But the heavy load and the intense strain of fighting the spring flood current, now at near record flood stage, soon proved too much. Between New Orleans and Vicksburg, the engines were pushed relentlessly, overheating one of the 4 boilers. A dangerous bulge had developed and began to leak. The stage was set for a disaster. The war that tore a nation apart had finally ended. Lee had surrendered. Prisoners long thought dead were coming home. But peace is fragile. In the span of days, joy turned to grief. A president lay dead, and a nation mourned. And in the shadows of that mourning, greed took root. In part 2, the Sultana heads north. The worst maritime disaster in American history is only beginning.